Promises should never be made. But who really thinks about that when living a moment of love and closeness? A father and daughter sealed a pact with blood, swearing never to be apart. A beautiful, symbolic gesture. But what they didn't know was that certain words, when spoken under the full moon, do not belong only to those who say them. There are forces that listen and demand their price. Stories like this may seem like mere legends, but anyone who has ever felt an inexplicable shiver knows that some things cannot be ignored. What began as a simple vow became an invisible prison. Time passed, but the pact was never forgotten. And when the father vanished without a trace, the daughter began to realize she was being watched. Objects moved, footprints appeared out of nowhere, and a whisper repeated the promise made years ago. Stories like this prove that the supernatural may be far more real than we imagine. But what do you do when you discover that a promise made in the past still demands to be fulfilled? Is there a way to break this bond without paying a terrible price? Or are some promises eternal, dragging those who make them toward an inescapable fate? The answer lies in the details, in the signs we often ignore. And believe me, this story will make you think twice before swearing something you cannot keep. Making a pact may seem symbolic, a promise sealed between two souls, but there are commitments that surpass human understanding. In the dead of night, under the pale glow of the moon, a father and daughter decided they would never part. A discreet cut on the skin, a handshake, and a vow made in the heat of the moment. What they didn't know was that some words, when spoken with unwavering faith, do not belong only to the living. Stories like this are not just legends. Just ask anyone who has ever felt an inexplicable shiver when remembering a promise made in the past. As the years passed, life moved on, but the pact was never forgotten. In conversations by the fireplace, in old photographs capturing smiles filled with complicity, everything seemed like a beautiful childhood memory. Until small signs began to appear, a chill without reason, shadows that seemed to move on their own, the strange sensation of being watched. It was as if the promise made years ago was slowly demanding its price. Stories like this start innocently, but end in ways few can foresee. Then came the inevitable. One night, like any other, without warning, without noise, the father disappeared. No note, no sign of struggle, just the overwhelming silence of an absence impossible to understand. The daughter, lost between grief and doubt, began to feel something even more disturbing. The presence of someone or something that seemed to always be there, lurking. The pact made in the past was not just a childhood oath. It was real. And now, what was once a bond of love might have turned into a prison with no way out. Not all promises belong to the world of the living. When the daughter, still dazed by her father's disappearance, decided to seek answers, she found an old woman living at the edge of the woods. She was known for her terrifying stories, but also for her wisdom. With eyes as deep as the night itself, the old woman merely sighed upon hearing about the pact. Words spoken under the full moon are never forgotten, she murmured. There were forces that did not forgive vows made in the heat of emotion, and that always came to collect their due, sooner or later. The young woman tried to argue, saying it was just an innocent promise, a gesture of love between father and daughter. But the old woman simply shook her head. You sealed a bond, and it doesn't end just because one of you is gone. It was hard to accept that something so intimate could have such dark consequences. However, the old woman told stories of others who had made the same mistake, and none of them had met a happy ending. Some heard voices in the dark, others saw shadows where they shouldn't exist. But they all had one thing in common, the feeling that they were never truly alone. Before the young woman could ask more, the old lady gave one final warning. If he disappeared without a trace, it means it wasn't just death that took him. Silence weighed in the air, as if that were a certainty, an unchangeable fate. But there was an even more disturbing detail. The promise made that night was still active. And if the father had been pulled to the other side, then sooner or later, she would be called to fulfill her part as well. At first, her father's disappearance seemed like an ordinary mystery, something that could be explained logically. But as days passed, no clues emerged. No sign of departure, no note, no witnesses who had seen anything suspicious. It was as if he had simply vanished. The daughter felt an increasing emptiness, but what disturbed her even more was the sensation of being watched. not just on the streets or in dark places, but inside her own home. Stories of unexplained disappearances always share something in common: the invisible presence of something left behind. The nights became unbearable. The air felt heavy, shadows took on strange shapes, and at times, she could swear she heard breathing nearby, even when she was alone. Sometimes, she woke up startled, her heart racing, feeling a cold touch on her arm. Was it just a nightmare? Or was something, or someone, trying to communicate? The memory of the pact returned to her mind as an undeniable truth. Stories like this don't end when we want them to, but when what was promised is fulfilled. Then, one night, a whisper cut through the silence. It was her father's voice. Weak, distant, but impossible to ignore. She tried to find the source of the sound, but nothing but darkness surrounded her. Fear mixed with hope, but deep down, she knew he was still there. Somehow, in some way, the promise made years ago was still alive, and perhaps there was no way to escape it anymore. The next morning, something strange happened. The living room floor was covered in muddy footprints, as if someone had walked there during the night. The problem? All the doors and windows were locked. No sign of forced entry, nothing to explain it. The most terrifying part was that the footprints seemed to come from outside, but led to nowhere. Stories of invisible presences always start like this, with small signs that defy logic and turn a familiar place into unknown territory. And it didn't stop there. Objects began to move on their own. At first, small things, like a chair that wasn't in the same place or a book that fell from the shelf without explanation. Then, the occurrences became more intense. Lights flickered for no reason, doors slammed shut with force, and sometimes, the radio turned on by itself, playing only static. What once seemed like coincidences was now impossible to ignore. Something, or someone, wanted to be noticed. Stories like this aren't just about hauntings, but about promises that refuse to be forgotten. But the worst of all was the whisper. Always the same, repeating the words of the pact made years ago. We will never be apart. The voice was all too familiar. It was her father's. It wasn't an echo of memory, nor was it imagination. It was real. And with each passing night, the sound became clearer, closer, as if he were trying to cross an invisible boundary to reach her. The pact was still active, and he wanted it to be fulfilled. Desperate for answers, the daughter searched every corner of the house, trying to find something that could explain what was happening. That's when, at the bottom of a forgotten drawer, she found an old, worn leather journal. It belonged to her father. The pages were filled with confused notes, fragments of thoughts that seemed to waver between sanity and terror. Between reflections on life, there were descriptions of disturbing nightmares, always with the same theme: a shadow calling him, reminding him of the pact. Stories of premonitory dreams always carry a warning. The problem is, we don't always want to listen. As she read, her heart pounded. On one of the last pages, her father had left a desperate warning, underlined multiple times. Never break the pact. But why? What would happen if she tried to free herself from this promise made years ago? The hastily written words hinted at fear, guilt, an internal battle he had fought alone for years. The journal mentioned that, before he disappeared, he always felt someone watching him, saw footprints that shouldn't have been there, and heard his own voice whispering things he had never said. Everything she was experiencing now, he had already faced before. But the final note was the most terrifying. If you are reading this, he has already come for me, and he will come for you too. Her blood ran cold. Her father knew there was no way out. He knew he was doomed from the moment they made that pact. And now, only one question remained. Was there a way to escape this fate? Or was the only option to wait for the moment when the shadow would come for her too? Desperation led her to a place she never imagined she would go. On the edge between reason and fear, she decided to seek the only person who might have answers: an old witch, known for her stories about spiritual bonds that could never be broken. The cottage where she lived was isolated, hidden among twisted trees that seemed to whisper with the wind. As soon as the young woman crossed the threshold, the woman lifted her eyes without needing an explanation. You can already feel his presence, can't you? Her raspy voice seemed to carry centuries of knowledge and a weight that made the skin crawl. The young woman told her everything. The footprints, the objects that moved, the whispers repeating the promise made years ago. The witch listened in silence, stirring herbs and casting stones onto the wooden table. You tied your soul to his. A blood pact does not dissolve like a handshake. She explained that such vows create invisible threads, as strong as chains. And if her father had already been taken to the other side, then sooner or later, the bond would fully close. He is not haunting you. He is calling you. Was there a way to break this bond? The witch sighed. Everything has a price. What was given to the beyond could not simply be taken back without consequences. Some promises do not fade. They can only be replaced by others. If the young woman wanted to be free, she would have to offer something in return. But before she could understand what that meant, the witch gave her one final warning. Be quick. With each passing night, he grows stronger. And soon, you will have no choice. The decision to face what awaited her came the moment the witch revealed the truth. If there was a place where everything could be resolved, it was there, at her father's forgotten grave. The cemetery was shrouded in a dense fog, and every step the young woman took seemed to echo in the sepulchral silence. The cold of dawn cut through her skin, but it wasn't the wind that made her shiver, it was the presence. Stories of ancient pacts always end like this, in places where the veil between worlds is thinnest, where death becomes almost tangible. Before the tombstone, she felt the air grow heavy, as if something invisible surrounded her. Then he appeared, not as a memory or an indistinct figure, but as a distorted shadow of what had once been her father. You promised. The voice came as a whisper carried by the wind. All this time, he had only been waiting for the right moment to claim her. It was a gentle yet undeniable summons, an invitation to cross the final boundary and fulfill her part of the pact. Stories like these remind us that some promises do not belong only to those who make them, but to whatever bore witness to them. The young woman wanted to believe she still had a choice, but the shadow advanced, extending a hand as cold as the very earth where his body lay. It was as if death was not an end, merely an extension of what they had promised. But something inside her refused to accept this fate. With tears welling in her eyes, she whispered an apology and prepared to do what no one had ever dared to attempt. Break the pact, no matter the cost. Fear could have paralyzed her, but it was the will to live that made her act. With trembling hands, she pulled from her pocket a piece of cloth stained with dried blood, the same one used to seal the pact years ago. The witch had said that the first step was to destroy the object that carried the essence of the oath. Striking a match against the cutting wind, she set the fabric ablaze. But as the flames consumed the cloth, a scream echoed through the cemetery. It was not a human sound. It was something far deeper, as if the world itself was protesting. Stories about the breaking of spiritual bonds always speak of resistance. Nothing sealed by something greater unravels without a fight. But it was not enough. Her father's spirit remained, unmoving, watching her with eyes void of any human trace. The sacred words should have dissipated the presence, dissolved the ties, but as she recited the verses the witch had taught her, the shadow only flickered, like a flame resisting the wind. Do you think you can break something that transcends death? His voice echoed, not with anger, but with sorrow. The pact was not just a promise, it was a prison. And now, it was no longer enough to simply want freedom. She had to offer something in return. The whispers around her grew louder, as if other voices were joining his. The wind swirled in spirals, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. It was as if the cemetery itself was alive, waiting to see her fail. Desperation took hold of her. What if there was no escape? What if trying to break the pact was an even greater mistake? Deep down, she knew that this kind of bond was not severed easily. And if there was a way out, she had to find it fast, before the shadow took her soul forever. The witch had warned, nothing breaks without a price. Burning the object of the pact and reciting sacred words had only been a test, a desperate act against something far older and more powerful. The father's shadow did not disappear. On the contrary, it seemed stronger, more present, as if the attempt to sever the bond had only awakened something dormant. Do you want to get rid of me? The voice was calm, devoid of anger, yet filled with infinite sorrow. Stories of spiritual bonds show that to cut one tie, another must be made. And the young woman was about to discover what that truly meant. If you want freedom, offer another promise, murmured the witch, her presence now seeming to merge with the night itself. But promises are not mere words cast into the wind. They have weight, consequence. What could be given in exchange for a blood bond? Something of equal value, the old woman added. And in that instant, the young woman understood the true meaning of sacrifice. Renouncing the pact was not enough. The debt had to be transferred. But to whom? The father's shadow waited, unhurried, for it knew she could not escape. Stories like these teach us that fate always collects its debts, sooner or later. The young woman pondered what she could offer. A memory? A piece of her soul? Or someone? The thought made her shudder. What if the only way out was to continue the cycle? To pass the burden on to another, just as so many had done before her? Time was running out. The ground felt colder, the air heavier. The choice lay before her. But every decision had a cost. And sometimes, even after paying, the debt is never truly settled. The relief was immediate. The air moved again, the night's cold lost its edge, and the cemetery's oppressive silence finally dissipated. The father's shadow faded, like smoke carried by the wind, and for the first time in weeks, the young woman felt she could breathe without the invisible weight on her shoulders. She had paid the required price. The pact was finally undone. At least, that's what she wanted to believe. Stories like these always make us think the danger has passed, until small signs prove otherwise. That night, she returned home exhausted, collapsing onto her bed without the strength to even think about what had just happened. Sleep came quickly, deep, as if her mind had finally allowed itself to rest. But when she awoke in the middle of the night, she felt an inexplicable chill. Something was wrong. The room was dark, but the hallway light flickered weakly. And then, as her eyes adjusted to the dimness, she saw it. Not inside the room, not at the door, but in the mirror. Her reflection stood there, staring at her. And then it blinked. Stories of broken promises always leave traces, and she had just realized that her soul was not yet completely free. The horror was not over. In truth, it had only changed form. The pact had been undone, but something remained on the other side. A presence, a fragment, a remnant of that unbreakable bond. Because some promises, no matter how much we try to erase them, do not disappear. They simply transform into something different. The mirror reflected her gaze, and for the first time, she wondered if she was still the same person who had begun this journey. Or if, in some way, a piece of her had been left forever trapped on the other side. Now you know that some promises are not just words carried by the wind. They create invisible bonds that can transcend time, even death. But the big question is, how many of these promises have you made without thinking about the consequences? Have you ever given your word to something you couldn't fulfill? Stories like this serve as a warning, because sometimes what starts as a simple oath can turn into a prison from which there is no escape. But what about you? Can you recall a moment when you felt that something from the past still haunts you? A promise that, no matter how much you try to forget, always finds its way back. What does this story make you think about the bonds we create without even realizing it? Leave your comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you've ever experienced something similar, share it, because sometimes the answers lie in each other's experiences. If you enjoyed this content and want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here, every video brings something that will make you see the world in a different way. So, until the next mystery, be careful with what you promise.